Right, I think we're good to go.
Lovely, thank you very much. Right, good evening everybody. Welcome to this evening's Finance and Audit Committee meeting, 9th of March 2021. Good to see you all here. We'll start. We have accepted, we've received apologies from Councillor Howe and Councillor Dowling. Deputy Town Clerk, you sent round a register for that. Do you need us to physically sign that or just have an acknowledgement on the email?
Oh, that was just so that you could see the reasons for the absence.
Lovely, thank you. Okay. Does anybody have a declaration of interest on any items on the agenda? No, lovely. Do we have any written requests for dispensation on disclosable pecuniary interests, if any? Nope. No, lovely, and therefore need to grant any requests. I'm assuming, as there's no one here, we have no requests for public participation. Good. Right, moving to the meat of the meeting. First item, number 6, is to approve the draft open and confidential minutes of the Finance and Audit Committee meeting held on the 12th of January 2021. Does anyone have any queries or issues to raise, or can we go to a poll on that? No queries? Okay, lovely. Deputy Town Clerk, could you? Lovely.
Okay. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, moving on to item 7, the Town Clerk's open and confidential report. Open report pages 1 to 10, appendices A to E, item 7.1, to receive the management accounts for the period of 1st of April 2020 to the 28th of February 2021. Does anybody have any queries, or Deputy Town Clerk, do you have anything you wish to raise for the attention of the meeting on that?
Nothing really further than my report, other than the good news, in as much as the expected deficit now for the end of the year is not quite as high as it was when we set the budget. So
excellent.
Hopefully the call on reserves won't be quite as great.
Lovely. Okay, does anyone have any items they wish to raise? No. Okay, then do we vote on receiving them, or do we acknowledge receipt? Acknowledge receipt. Okay. Okay. Item 7.2 is to consider a budget environment for funding the strategic partnership initiative concept design. It is in the background is already in the Deputy Town Clerk's open report. This is essentially to support our initiative to have a feasibility study in support of our neighbourhood development plan. The process went through tender, and all the tenders that were received were considerably above what we initially budgeted for it. We are anticipating receiving some additional funds to support it from Warwickshire County Council, but we are required to find some additional funding for ourselves. In the climate change emergency subgroup, we agreed, or they agreed, to allow £7,000 of this year's budget to be used towards the feasibility redesign project, on the understanding that they would then be made good in the following financial year. So we are essentially at this point asking to consider the budget environment to ensure that this project takes off and we can go ahead with it, as it's something I think we all feel strongly about. So do I have any queries or? Okay, again, is this a consider or a vote upon, Deputy Town Clerk?
The requirement tonight really is to identify potentially where council, if the agreement, the recommendation is for the town council to underwrite the budget deficit on this item. what alternatives can be used going forward in order to reimburse the money that the climate change group have agreed if you like to lend to this project. So,
yes.
so in my report there were some suggestions.
Yes, that's right. Yes, you do.
Whether members wish to consider or promote or suggest something else.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Curtis, I believe. Sorry, I think your hand was up.
I think Councillor Richard Voss was up.
What was Councillor Voss ahead of you? I've got overlapping screens.
It's a
Councillor
race.
Voss, do jump in.
It's a race to the top. So, I mean, I absolutely support it, and I think we'll take advice from the Deputy Clerk in terms of where the money should be drawn from. Can I just add to that? At some point, we will also need to consider funds to support communications, and I think we all know how important this will be to ensure that this very exciting and positive project step forward is properly communicated with all the stakeholders, from residents to businesses to visitors. We are engaging deeply with other councils, our lead authorities, they're fully involved, but we will need to do this properly. And we've seen in other areas throughout the town over recent years how communications can undermine very promising projects, and we do not need or want to let this happen. So at some point we're going to have to find some funds, I don't think an enormous amount of money, but some funds to underpin and support professional communications so that we don't fall at the very first hurdle.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Councillor Curtis.
Thanks, yeah. Yes, I completely agree with Councillor Voss on those points. I would have suggested that unless the Deputy Town Clerk has other sort of proposals, that we would consider looking at options either 2 or 4. The Shakespeare birthday celebrations hasn't happened, so that is effectively an underspend in that area, or a budget veerment from the general reserve. I would be less keen on, if you like, looking at taking expenditure from other designated projects. That would be just my thoughts, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. And Councillor Alcott.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, very much to echo Councillor Curtis here. Looking through the options that we have to help underwrite this very important project, which I am 100% behind, the one that jumped out to me was the Shakespeare birthday celebrations. That is something we as a town council put on for the people of Stratford-upon-Avon. And to me, this project is also for the people of Stratford-upon-Avon. So to me, it's not taking it away from where it needs to be used, such as the vehicle replacement. We are going to need that because we want a cleaner car. Mm-hmm. A cleaner as in environmentally cleaner, not just to explain that bit. So yes, I would like to put forward that we use that option 2, and we take it out the Shakespeare Birthday Celebration Fund that was not used for 2020.
Thank you, Councillor Alcott. I have oh, there you are. Mr. Mayor.
Yeah, 2 questions for the Deputy Town Clerk, really. The 13,000, I thought we were going to use SIL money for the 13,000, and I wasn't quite sure where that 13,000 sits. Do we still need to do environment if we're using that 13,000 from SIL money? Is one question.
Right, and the answer is no. There is a separate designated reserve of SIL funds, so that money is already ring fenced for whatever projects council agreed to spend the money on. So the amount that we're talking about for environment is only the difference between the amount given by the climate change group less the amount that we receive from Warwickshire County Council, which is a small amount. So, no. Well, plus there needs to be some contingency for the additional costs, such as communication and things. So essentially the situation is that when the budget was agreed, this particular project was not within, there was not an awareness that this particular project was going to exceed the level of funds available in SIL. So it's really now to determine where if you like, any potential deficit on this project will be funded from going forward.
Right. Okay. Yeah. My other question is,
Yeah, there is this initial at least 7,000 to be returned, if you like, to the Climate Change Fund, but there's additional funds also required to be sort of ring fenced for this project going forward.
Yeah, and just in the ordinary course of events, the underspend for the Shakespeare birthday celebrations, would that just be returned to general reserves?
Yes, it would.
So actually, whether we use 2 or 4 doesn't really make a great deal of difference.
Yeah, it's essentially, if this was to wait until the year-end process had been completed, then yeah, it's sort of ultimately it amounts to the same thing. But if a decision or recommendation is made tonight to take it from the surplus in birthday celebrations, then we can create a designated reserve as part of the year-end process. So it's clearly ring-fenced and earmarked going forward in next year's account.
Oh, right. So item 2 is the better option that way. Yeah. Okay. Fine. Thanks.
Okay. I think the consensus appears to be with item 2. Could we have a proposer and a seconder for that, please? Thank you, Councillor Alcock.
Can I propose? Sorry, would you like the wording for the proposal?
Yes, please. Let's do it right.
Can I propose that we support the underwriting of this project, and regarding where we take the money from, can I suggest that we use the current designated fund? That was the Shakespeare birthday celebrations 1920, 2020, please.
Thank you. And do we have a seconder? Lovely. Thank you, Councillor Curtis. Okay, could we throw out a poll for that? Thank you. That's great. Excellent. Okay, excellent. So we can put that in train, and that means we can start moving forward that and get this extremely exciting project underway. Okay, item 7.3, which is another budget environment. This is to support live screening of council meetings. Presumably you've all read your open report. I'm just scrubbing down. So essentially we are looking to via or use budget surplus otherwise identified to enable there to be sufficient funds, costs estimated in the region of £10,000 in order to make this possible. I think we have all agreed in previous meetings, and it has been minuted, that this is something that we all agree is important to move forward. I think this is one of the positive things that has come out of this really rather terrible year, that increasing public engagement and public access to our meetings is highly desirable, and that therefore in order to carry on with this, once we're back in live meetings, we're obviously going to have the equipment to be able to do this. Home PCs not lending themselves to having working in the council chambers. So if we could just have a discussion on this, Mr. Mayor. Thank you.
Yeah, following on from the discussion on the last item, I just think, yes, this is something we definitely want to do, and I'd recommend that we use the underspend on the event security as the way forward. Yeah.
Okay, Councillor Alcock, sorry.
Sorry, everybody. Excuse me. Councillor Alcock spent the afternoon on Bishopton Field being.
And is now paying the price.
So please excuse me. I didn't actually hear, but I presume Mr. Mayor just said about using the amendment from the events committee.
Yeah.
Yes, I don't have a problem with that. We also need to keep in the back of our mind, councillors, is that we also cancelled or postponed the 2021 Shakespeare birthday celebrations in April. So again, there is there will be something left from there. But yes, the event security, we did not put on the events in 2020 that we wanted to. So again, I agree with using that money for this system.
Excellent. Okay, I don't have any other hands up, so could we then please have a proposer and seconder for this item? Yes. Thank you. Councillor Alcock.
Can I propose that we go ahead with the purchasing of the screening equipment required for our meetings when we finally return to the town hall, and that we use what Mr. Mayor suggested, which was the money budgeted for event security.
Lovely.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. Councillor Dyer, were you seconding? Lovely. Thanks very much. Great stuff. Okay, item 7.4, to review the designated reserves required for 21-22.
Hang on, we're just voting.
Oh, beg your pardon. Sorry, it was all the happy faces. I forgot we had to vote. Lovely. Super. Thank you very much. Deputy Town Clerk, could you talk us through the designated reserve item?
Yes, thank you. We're currently in the process of getting ready for year end, and part of the discussions with the accountants are really to confirm the designated reserves that are set as at the 31st of March, but will appear in the financial statements and therefore carried forward for the rest of next year and will then be used appropriately. So as per my report, I've listed the existing designated reserves that are in place, and just the comments against each one as to whether, well, basically what should happen with them. So I then go on to talk about the new designated reserves that were requested as part of the budget process. But if we could perhaps just go through, I think the new ones, if you like, are fairly clear cut. They were discussed by committees during the budget process, so those have, if you like, already been agreed. So this is just noting those. But if we could just confirm that members are happy with the comments in the first section relating to the existing designated reserves, that they are in agreement that this is what should happen. So if we start with, if I'll just go through them, and then if anybody has any objections to any of the comments, then please speak up. But it is proposed that the building maintenance reserve is reduced based on the expenditure in the current year, which will obviously only be determined at year end.
Councillor Alcock, did you have a query about that?
Yes. Did we make that decision before we discovered the additional issues that we have with the town hall? Because we found that additional problem, haven't we? That could need some work with the cracks in the ceiling. So actually reducing that reserve now could put us with issues later on when we come to do this maintenance.
Right. The situation with the building maintenance reserve is that there are insufficient funds in that reserve as it stands to cover all the work that is likely to be required on the town hall over the next few years. So the level that currently exists in that reserve is, if you like, historically a figure that appeared from quite a few years ago, and in the last few years has gradually been decreased by substantially less expenditure than has been happening to the town hall since the quinquennial inspection and the planned preventive maintenance. So I think it's already been acknowledged in budget discussions that that reserve is insufficient to fund everything that needs to be done. Because of the delays in all the maintenance work that would have been undertaken on the town hall this year, then expenditure in the current year is not as great as had been budgeted. So there is still sufficient capacity within that reserve to fund the expenditure in the current year. I think there needs to be a decision at some point further down the line, or indeed tonight, to say either that this designated reserve is maintained at the level that it is, or in next year's budget process it will potentially need to be topped back up, or brought back to a level at some point in the future to ensure that ongoing maintenance can be covered from this reserve. But at the moment, I think, given that given there were some considerable concerns in the budget process, that the general reserve needed to be maintained at a level to meet the reserves policy. In this year's accounts, we could reduce this reserve rather than take it from the general reserve, and everything will still be aligned without causing a concern at this point. But yes, certainly going forward, if you like, this time next year, there will have to be a decision on where all the work will be funded from, because otherwise the building maintenance reserve will be depleted completely.
But equally,
assuming the work goes ahead.
Presumably we need to get a better idea of some of the upcoming work in order to plan how much we,
that's
need
right.
to do. Okay.
Yes.
Mr. Mayor.
Yeah, my gut feel is that we need to have enough in the designated reserve for building maintenance for 21-22 to cover the cost of the work that's going to be done. So, I mean, we haven't got the estimates yet, but I suspect if you're going to reduce it by 40,000 down to 110, that 110 is not going to be enough. Is that? So I'm tempted to. I mean, going forward, we are going to spend the money. It's just a question of which pots do we take it from. And at the moment, you'll be taking some from the building maintenance reserve and some from general reserves. Well, I'm tempted to say, let's make sure the building maintenance designated reserve is adequate, would be my proposal.
Okay.
Councillor Lee.
I think I'm in agreement with the mayor in terms of let's make the building maintenance reserve fit for purpose. What I don't have any information on is what is required. So I think before we make the decision as to what the reserve needs to be and how we need to fund that reserve, I'd like to see estimates and a schedule of when works will take place.
The issue with that's going to be a timing issue in that we're going to have to determine the year-end accounts within the next 6 to 8 weeks, and I know a tender process has now been initiated to ask for contractors to submit quotes, estimates and things for the planned work for next year, but I don't think that information will be back and agreed before the year-end accounts have to be signed off.
You mentioned before it was sufficient what's in there to cover it, isn't it? Or you think it is?
So it was sufficient to cover the costs that have been incurred in this current financial year. But I take Mr. Mayor's point that it really shouldn't fall below the level of expenditure in next year's budget, which has been set, which I think is, sorry, I haven't got the budget in front of me, but I think it's probably either I think it's around about 127,000, something like that. So rather than what I've suggested in the report, as in running it down by the amount of spend this year, I think it shouldn't be run down any lower than the budget figure for next year's accounts. And then next year, when we get more information about all the costs, then we can reconsider this again as part of the budget process for the following year, having more detail about what the true costs will be going forward.
Okay, so just let me get that right then. So you're saying next year's budget isn't 127. We've got 40 spent this year, so that would lead to 167. Would that be the required level of the reserve to cover this year's and next year's spend?
Well, sorry, if this year's spend is going to be reflected on the 31st of March, then if we took the 40,000 out from this year, we need to ensure that building maintenance reserve doesn't go below the, say, for example, the 127,000 that would be required for next year.
So we're after about £17,000 then additional.
Potentially, as I say, it's obviously until the year end confirms what we've actually spent.
Yeah.
I can obviously double check the budget figure after the meeting and confirm that. Having said that, that does then put us in the position in a year's time that if spending goes as per the budget, then this reserve would be depleted at the end of next year, and a decision would then need to be made to ensure that it was replenished to fund the expenditure expected on the town hall in 22-23, if you see what I mean. So it's sort of going to be a rolling rolling decision to make with this, I think, over the next few years, because each time we come to do further work on the town hall, we will then get definitive costs of what that work will be. And at the moment, we're in a situation where we seem to be, if you like, the budget was set based on estimated figures from a couple of years ago. The expenditure this year didn't go to budget because of COVID restrictions. So if you like, for the last couple of years, we've always been working with guesstimated figures, shall we say, based on a projected figure over 2 or 3 years, a period of 2 or 3 years.
Mr. Mayor.
So just a quickie on timings. The meeting to look at the tenders from the contractors that the work's gone out to, that's on the 1st of April. So at least that on that date, we will have an indication of the total costs that might be involved, which might, is that in time to do something or not?
Yeah, the year-end accounts process will effectively start about, I think I need to send a backup of the account system to the accountants on the 9th of April. So yes, on the basis if we have a better idea of what the figures are going to be, then as part of the proposal for year-end accounts, I can sort of say that this building maintenance reserve needs to be held at that particular level.
Councillor Voss.
So, I mean, I'm not sure which way to go here, so I'm going to turn to the Deputy Town Clerk and say that your advice and direction to ensure that prudence, we know how important that is in the management of money, is maintained, and fiscal propriety, so that we don't fall foul of any financial regulations. Whichever way we go, there's enough money in a pot, whichever pot that is, to manage it, but it just needs to be done right, doesn't it? And others are better qualified maybe to take a view on what right is. I'm not, and I guess you can go either way, 110, 150, 127, 167. In your view, what is the right thing to do for the end of year? Because that's what you're looking to do, isn't it?
Yeah, I think based on the comments made by Mr. Mayor, I actually, on reflection, I would say rather than reduce it down based on this year's spend, it would make sense to reduce it to the level to ensure that there is sufficient there to cover what we've budgeted for next year. And then obviously in the course of the year, if further costs are identified, as per any budget discussion, if any costs exceed the budgeted figure agreed, then we would have to come back to a committee meeting and sort of discuss how that deficit would be funded going forward. So yeah, based on discussions now tonight, I would recommend that building maintenance reserve is set at the level to cover the budgeted expenditure for 2021-22.
Okay.
I think is 127,000, but I would need to double check after the meeting.
Okay, lovely. Moving on to the cemetery.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, the members may be aware, some time ago there were discussions on the requirement that at some point the space at the cemetery is running short, and there is a requirement by the council to acquire more land. I appreciate if you like, the discussions around that will be confidential, but essentially the money that's currently sat in that reserve wouldn't be sufficient to fund the acquisition of further land. So the suggestion in the report here is that the allotment reserve, which has been essentially held at that sort of level historically for quite some time now, without a requirement for that money to be spent further on the allotment, then the recommendation is to transfer 20,000 from the allotment reserve into the cemetery land and building reserve, which hopefully would then have sufficient funds for as and when the acquisition of new land is actually processed or proceeded with.
Is everyone happy with that? Yep. Okay. If we can move on to the
the others are more straightforward, really. The proposal for the Christmas festival, vehicle replacement, election expenses, and the community infrastructure levy are essentially all to increase those in line with what was budgeted, and certainly the latter one, the community infrastructure levy, essentially whatever receipts we get from via the district council will automatically go into that reserve unless they are spent on. And as we discussed in the previous item, that community infrastructure levy has already been earmarked to cover the costs of the town centre project. So the designated reserve will be increased, but then in next year's expenditure, the reserve will be depleted as it's contributed to that project. The other reserves that are listed in my report reflect discussions as I said, during the budget process, and for under the new terms of reference for the new committee structure, each standing committee had the opportunity to request a designated reserve for them to use going forward. So just the point, a couple of points made here really are that as well as the unexpected expenditure required on the boundary wall at the Holy Trinity Church that was identified at the start of the year, during budget discussions, it was proposed that a designated reserve would be created going forward for the churchyard and for other monuments owned by, well, the churchyard isn't owned by the council, but for things like the memorial garden, things like that. So a designated reserve was proposed of 20,000, but I would just like to emphasise the point that the repair work on the wall is unlikely to be completed in the current financial year. So my recommendation there is that whatever funds are required to get that work done need to be put in the designated reserve in addition to the 20,000 that was requested going forward. And a similar situation applies really with the climate change designated reserve. I appreciate that group has, if you like, agreed to lend 7,000 across to this other project, but whatever they haven't spent in this year's budget, I think should be rolled into their designated reserve going forward.
Thank you. Okay. Councillor Voss.
So just in terms of the boundary wall, I know it falls into another committee, but any news on cost for that? And were we not inquiring about insurances? Is there any progress?
Yeah, the situation with the insurance, it was one of those where they would need to look at the complete risk. So they asked for an estimate of the total cost of replacing the entire wall, which, as you can imagine, would be substantial sums of money. But then actually in having those discussions, it was suddenly apparent, if you like, or the penny dropped, that actually the boundary wall at the churchyard isn't owned by the town council. It is owned by the church. So we cannot, if you like, logically add insurance to cover the cost of repairing a piece of property that doesn't actually belong to the town council. So what that does mean is that it exposes the town council to a risk of having the responsibility to maintain the boundary wall at the Holy Trinity Churchyard, but not being in a position to, if you like, insure against that risk. But having said that,
does the church not insure against it? Would it not be covered in the churches, or are we just going to keep sort of going around in circles? Well, they own it, but we are responsible for it.
Yeah, it's I think there is a bit of a, if you like, a grey area here that I think it's come up on the forums of other town and parish councils, that where a town or parish council has a responsibility to maintain a closed churchyard, that potentially exposes them to a considerable risk if some fundamental catastrophe sort of happens, which generally doesn't tend to happen. But at the moment, we can't see any way around the fact other than the town council having to, fund the cost of the wall repairs. Having said that, the latest discussions, I think, it is hopeful that the cost that had been earmarked, it's not going to be as high as had been spoken about before. But I do know other clerks have said they've sort of, if you like, tried to work with the church communities to agree what is reasonable for the council to have to pay for as and when it's required.
Okay. Councillor Dyer.
Can I clarify that? I think that is the original graveyard of Stratford-upon-Avon, right? And I also understand that ward was the responsibility of us, the town council.
It is the responsibility of the town council to maintain the churchyard, but the town council doesn't own the churchyard or any of the walls around it. So our insurance company would not agree to take the risk of insuring something that doesn't belong to.
That's interesting. Thank you.
Right. Okay. So I think we have covered all of the reserves. So, Deputy Town Clerk, are you requiring? We've reviewed them and discussed them, changed a couple of things. Do you need us now to vote to recommend that work, or are you?
Yeah, if somebody could propose that the changes discussed tonight are if you like agreed as part of the year-end process, then that would be good.
Okay. Do I have a proposer?
Sorry, I meant to say yes.
Sorry.
A proposer and a seconder, and then
Proposer and a seconder.
Well, I'll break the chain and I'll propose.
Lovely.
So I'm proposing that we accept the Deputy Town Clerk's recommendations in respect of the designated reserves.
Thank you. Councillor Alcock, was that your hand to second?
I will second that proposal.
Thank you very much. Lovely jubbly. Okay, item 7. Oh, shut up.
Okay, thank you. That's unanimous. Thank you.
Thank you. And item 7.5, to review the council's financial risk assessment management.
This is really to note, just essentially there's been no further progress with this since last year. So rather than spend time on reviewing something that's already been identified as requiring further work, then it's really just to make members aware that although it's part of the annual review, this item needs to be postponed until we can actually make some progress with it.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, 7.6, approved supplier and service providers list to review and recommend. Does anybody have any issues arising from the list that was circulated? Mr. Mayor.
Yeah, it's just a question really. Can I just check that nobody's been removed? Deputy Town Clerk, can you confirm that? Because removing somebody when they wouldn't have had the opportunity, because of COVID, a lot of the suppliers wouldn't have had the opportunity to work with us in the last 12 months. So it doesn't seem right to remove them in those circumstances. I don't think anybody's been removed, but I was just checking.
Actually, I was going to raise the fact there's one sort of slight anomaly in that council's approved architect or building consultant who was used before last year has actually been removed because members should be aware the council appointed a new conservation architect last year. So in the list was updated based on invoices received in the last 12 months from the accounts system. And after I'd distributed the report last week, I spoke to my colleague because I realised that the new architect isn't actually on the list now. And what appears to have happened is that although he's obviously been working with us for most of the last 12 months, we haven't received an invoice for his time as yet. So, so although I've sent the list out, what I do need to ask you to be aware of is there are two people who need to be added to that list. So I do need to revise it before I confirm it. One of them is Stephen Oliver, who is the Oliver Architect Limited, who is the conservation architect who's been working with us. And the other one is David Bishton, who is a structural engineer who has been working with us with regard to the repairs to the boundary wall at Holy Trinity Church. And again, we've been talking with him, or he's been helping us the last couple of months. But again, we haven't been invoiced for any of his time at this point, but we expect to be invoiced at some point when the work is carried out. So those two suppliers will be added. But yeah, the process of removing suppliers that haven't been used for the last 3 years, I didn't follow that approach this year, because as you say, the last 12 months has not been a typical year. So the fact that we haven't necessarily been invoiced by an approved supplier in the last 12 months doesn't necessarily mean that we won't be using them going forward.
Thank you. Councillor Dyer, is your hand up, or is that, no, it's not from last time? Okay, thank you. So on the understanding that those 2 additional suppliers will be added back onto the list, I think we can now vote to recommend that that list is passed to the council. If we can have someone to propose that, we'll go ahead.
Do you need a proposer, Councillor? Chair, sorry. Did you need a proposer?
I noticed, well, it was a note, but I think as we're recommending it to pass it to the council, I think we do actually need a proposer.
Right, I'm happy to propose that we
Okay.
approve the approved supplies list.
Excellent, and
I'll second.
lovely. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And if you would finish voting, we'll now vote. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, item 7.7, to review the council's financial regulations and the Finance and Audit Committee's terms of reference, which is to note a report, and the terms of reference remain up to date. It is recommended that these are adopted and approved and adopted. And then in addition, the current version of the financial regulations, Appendix E, members are requested to review these. Otherwise, it's recommended they are approved and adopted, subject to the changes in the wording related to the RFA and the DTC. So does anybody have any queries or issues arising from these? No. Okay, is there anything you wish to raise for us, Deputy Town Clerk, or are you happy for us to?
No, if
okay.
you confirm them as they stand.
Okay, could I then please have a proposer to recommend that these are recommended to somebody? Thank you, Councillor Dyer.
do we need to do that if it's just for noting?
There's 2 recommendations in there, I think,
okay,
as
sorry.
well. Yeah, that's fine.
Sorry.
Can I take that as you as a seconder for that? Lovely, thank you. Okay, can we have a poll?
Thank you, that's
great stuff. Okay, so item 7.8, to review the council's banking arrangements and investments. We are asked to note the Deputy Town Clerk's report on this matter. Was there anything else you wanted to add, Deputy Town Clerk, to that?
Yeah, I think it was just quickly, members hopefully would have picked up some emails I sent out earlier today, forwarded today from the CCLA regarding their property sector deposit fund, and there are basically there are some concerns that we may be heading into a situation where some cash investments could actually result in negative returns. So as members will be aware, the Bank of England interest base rate is at a historic low level of 0.1%. This means that a lot of cash investments, certainly when you take account of management charges for managing funds and things, could actually result in negative returns. I think the Bank of England has instructed all financial institutions to make preparations to enable negative interest rates to be implemented. But having spoken to our account manager at CCLA today, he's emphasised that this is just precautionary. It's they're being prudent. They're putting things in place to ensure that the fund can continue to be used going forward in that eventuality. But there is no intention at this moment in time for them to actually, if you like, for them to be pushing the fund that has negative returns. They've also confirmed to me that there is no suggestion that councils' access to those funds would be suspended at any point. If the markets do mean that negative interest rates or negative yields are likely to happen, we will be given notice of that. So it's really just to make you aware that it's a situation that applies across all investment platforms at the moment, that there is a lot of talk about whether that might happen. I think there are concerns that depending on your economic outlook, you might not want that to happen at the moment because it could impact on the economic recovery post-COVID. So again, just to emphasise, it was very much a case of they have made us aware that that is a situation that could arise, but they are not suggesting that that is what's going to happen imminently. And the investment strategy will need considerable detailed review at the meeting in November when the long-term investment become when mature. But if members do have any concerns at all about this fund and would rather, if you like, avoid any chance of having a negative return from it, then the easiest option would just be to withdraw the funds and leave them in the bank. But from my conversation today, the account manager has assured me that, you know, if we don't make that decision tonight, we're not going to suddenly start losing money tomorrow. We would be given plenty of notice that there is a potential for that to happen. So because the funds can be withdrawn within 24 hours, I don't believe there's any risk in either leaving them there. But if any members would prefer that the money was moved elsewhere at this point, then we can agree to do that as well.
Thank you. Councillor Voss.
So two things, just in the banking, first on banking, we've talked about it before and you put it in your report about possibly moving the banking over to Lloyd's. Now that would also have an implication on payroll, wouldn't it? Because I'm presuming in that case we wouldn't, yeah. So that's where the nuances of timings and responsibility, and they're always difficult. Presumably at some point you'll sort of regenerate that opportunity.
Yeah, I think obviously it's been a strange year this year. I think a year ago when we were talking about trialling a potential move of the banking arrangements, that was before the issues with COVID and things. So I think given, it's like with a lot of things, while the situation has forced certain things to be changed or people to reevaluate the way they do things, I think at the moment it's probably not the best time to try and be changing the bank account. So we'll revisit that when things have settled down.
And then the other one is on investments. And if you're saying that we need to have a serious conversation in November, we need to have some serious insight to it as well. And, you know, whilst we all have a fairly broad understanding of money's in and money's out, when it comes to investment, that's a lot more complicated. Would there be any point in inviting our respectable and respected investment manager to a future finance meeting before November to give us a strong overview of what all the ramifications are? And you may feel competent and confident to do that, but there is some pressure on us then if we are to have that serious discussion.
Yeah, what I would say with that is I appreciate that quite a few of you were not on the finance committee or weren't even members of the council when the investment decision with CCLO was made. So, but Mark Davis, I'm sure he'd be more than happy to attend a meeting to talk through. As you're aware, we currently have two investments with CCLA. The sort of higher risk one is with the local authorities property fund, which in the circumstance of the last 12 months has actually performed relatively well. But he could certainly talk to you about the implications and what their thoughts are going forward with that, because that, if you like, that is, in my view, that is more of a risk to the council in terms of essentially it's we own shares that, you know, the value could go up as well as down. The public sector deposit fund, really, when the investment in that was first made, it was because the yield from that fund was significantly more than we could get just by leaving the money in the bank account. But because of the drop in base rate over the last 4 years, essentially it is returning a very minimal return. I think we get about £1 interest a month on it. So it's it's neither here nor there for what is left in that fund. And the way to get better returns at this time is to put the money in longer term investments, but then obviously that then ties funds up. And given that council is running a budget deficit at the moment, liquidity is quite crucial in the next 6 to 12 months. So essentially, a lot of the funds that we have had available for longer term investments are going to be required in the next 12 months to fund some of the deficits that are likely to happen. So
I think it'd be good. Yeah.
Certainly, I think our account manager, I'm sure, would be more than happy to come and explain to members now what the situation is regarding the other fund, because again, we've been in that fund now. The minimum period at the time they recommended was at least 5 years. It was very much a long-term option. So we've sort of had money in for over 4 years now. So it might well be that council either agree that it's still, the risk is well rewarded. We get a substantially higher yield from that investment than we would by any other short to medium or even long-term investment. So I think members will have seen from management accounts repeatedly that the yield on that fund, the dividends we have got from that fund over the last 3 to 4 years, are substantially more than we would have got if we just invested that money in a fixed term bond or something.
Right. Thank you. Councillor Curtis. Sorry.
Sorry. First one of the evening. Thank you, Chair. Thank you very much. Deputy Clerk, just a couple of sort of questions for clarity, if you wouldn't mind. How much cash value, or what is the value of the assets that the council has invested in funds that could be at risk of negative interest? And then the other question was, it's reassuring that obviously if you only need to give 24 hours notice, there's very little risk of exposure. But I was just wondering, what authority do you need? Additional authority? Would there need to be an extraordinary meeting of this committee, or what authority would you need to make that transfer should it be required?
So the particular fund that we're talking about, where the concerns about negative yields are being raised, is the public sector deposit fund, which we now only have just under 34,500 left in that fund. So it's been left there, if you like, in the last 12 months, almost as an emergency fund. The exposure there is not great. The biggest risk, if you like, is the council has £250,000 invested in the local authority property fund. That is a share-based fund. So at the time of investing in that, like with anything, the price can go up, it can go down. As I said in my report, the prices now are more than they were when council invested, and the yield that's been returned in the 4 years since council made that investment is, I think it's sort of, it's substantially more than it would have been by any other investment vehicle that was available to the council. So there was a situation last year with COVID restrictions that meant dealing in that fund was suspended. So, but I don't think we're heading back to the times of the financial crisis that occurred in 2008, where obviously a lot of funds went through very difficult times. So, as I say, I think it would well be worth Mark Davis coming along, because given the council will need to review all the investments, the other longer term investments are in fixed term bonds, so they will mature in November, December this year. But the whole investment spread, if you like, short, medium, long-term investments, needs to be looked at very carefully at the end of this year to determine, what needs to be done with all of the funds, really, and to ensure there is sufficient liquidity to fund the council's spending over the next few years.
Let's definitely work for us for the upcoming year to try and get a handle on that. Does anybody have any other queries relating to banking arrangements and investments? This was simply something to note. If you're happy to move on, right, okay. And then in addition to note the report on the updates to the fixed assets register, I think this is another one that's in progress but slightly hampered by the previous year non-events. Does anyone have any queries on that? No? Okay, are you happy to note? Yeah, lovely, thank you. And then I've got item 8, the responsible financial officer's verbal report for information only. Is that what we've already covered?
Yeah, the item I was going to raise there was really about the negative returns, which I've already discussed as part of the previous.
Yes, I think we're going to have to spend some time on this next year to look at the strategy going forward. Okay, thank you. In which case, item 9, date, time and venue of next meeting is Tuesday the 8th of June, 6:30 at the Town Hall, hopefully, or 6 p.m. by Zoom software if virtual meetings are still in place. So thank you all for this evening's meeting, and hopefully we will meet in person next time.